I'm Jacopo Penso, member of Opera Nova School in Italy, the school founded by Roberto Gotti. I'm speaking to you from Martial Art Museum and the Garitings Study Center in Brescia, the official center of the Italian Fencing Federation for research on historical fencing and European martial art. My warmest thanks to Mr. Ing Chao for his kind invitation. It is a pleasure to take part in this year's conference, even if not in person. With this small contribution, I'd like to talk about a martial practice of the past, a training game rediscovered through the analysis of several depictions and some written sources. A research paper in collaboration with Professor Maud Perez-Simon from La Sorbonne Nouvelle University in Paris is in publication regarding this work. In the last 3 decades, the martial gesture of European tradition has been subject of investigation and restoration. The main sources of this rediscovery have been fight books and treatises made by master-at-arms, especially from Renaissance time. However, we have always considered it necessary to keep an interdisciplinary approach, embracing diversified sources of information. Archaeological, metallurgical, artistic, and literary studies have played a crucial role in keeping a wide understanding of martial phenomena. Old masters we study were in close connection to artists, intellectuals, leaders of their time. Often, they themselves were eclectic figures with several professions, talents, and skills. Martial art was the expression of a socio-cultural environment, influenced by social norms, tools, and contexts of application. It was widespread and commonly known, and as a consequence, subject of re-elaboration by social products, source of inspiration for cultural, technological, and artistic production. This is the perspective we can use to frame the study of the Gioco del Civettino, in English, Howl Game, as a brilliant example of interdisciplinary dialogue. Until the half of the 16th century, martial games and training prepared the body and mind of young people for combat. Martial art was widespread and practiced, and could not be limited to a specific and selective exercise, so its learning was not sanctioned by a specific time, age, or place. The complexity and variety of application from war to duel created individual and social need to have trained bodies starting at an early age and involving not just an elite of warriors, but a large part of the population. This is the origin of practice of physical confrontation with ritualized and educational violence used inside urban context, with a mixture of recreational, sports, and martial purposes. Examples of these are the Gioco del Ponte, the bridge game, in Pisa, La Guerra dei Pugni, the War of the Fists, in Venice, or similar mass boxing practice in the city of Gubbio. From the chronicles we know, the episodes of violent degeneration were not rare, in which boundaries between feast, game, and brawl were crossed. Other references to martial art education derive from the revival of the classical era. An example is Antonio Cornazzano de Re Militari, which, citing Vegezius' work, wrote about the training on the wooden pole, considering it an educational tool for young people, with not only physical but also moral value, and considering the military predominance of the Roman people in antiquity to be the result of this widespread practice among his youth. A common training exercise was unarmed wrestling, a discipline widely practiced, of which we may find many representations. Wrestling could be expressed in different ways, ranging from recreational practice to training, to competitive fights, up to self-defense and application in real combat. It was practiced for educational purposes and learned as an integral part of armed combat to manage close-measure situations or to defend from unexpected aggressions like in Marozzo lessons. Master Pietro Monte considered wrestling a fundamental physical exercise, necessary before learning armed discipline. In the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, 1528, wrestling is cited as a playful activity practiced by young nobles together with villani, common people, demonstrating a transversality between social classes, all in the presence of the public, which enjoyed the competition. Multiple natures of wrestling emerge from the study of the anonymous Italian manuscript from 16th century called Postura, now preserved in the collection of the Martial Art Museum. For example, the same takedown technique is depicted in a double way, one with two unarmed fighters practicing on a mat, and on the second time with two opponents armed with swords in a fencing context. Precious testimonies of martial cultures and games related to training emerge from the study of figurative production. Although in this case there is no real didactic intent in the source, these representations are precious photographs, snapshots, pictures that immortalize moments of daily life, from which we can reconstruct lost practice and recover aspects sometimes overlooked or less understandable from bibliographic sources. An example of these are the ceiling tablets with two players maneuvering a long stick, each at one of the two hands, playful preparation for the use of polearms. Or the other one with the two players sitting on the ground, their legs extended in front of them, with the feet in contact, and the hands firmly holding the same stick, a test of strength, technique, and cunning, part of the traditional heritage of many cultures between North Europe and Asia, and today widespread internationally under the name of mass wrestling. Or again, the fresco of the Broletto in Novara, the communal assembly square, which shows a fight with sticks and a large basket to protect the head, next to a scene of wrestling. Among these martial games is the object of our research, the Civettino game. The first representation of the game we encountered was that of the birthing plate of Palazzo Davanzati in Florence, followed by that of the frescoes of the Volta Pinta of the Loggia in the town hall of Assisi. From the study of the images, a first reconstruction of the game was born, combining the representation of the game with the martial art training experience from Opera Nova School. With big surprise, and thanks to the collaboration with Professor Maud Perez-Simon, many other sources, both pictorial and textual, have been discovered. The last lucky find has been the frescoes on the Gonzaga family palace in Mantova. The Civettino game is played with three participants arranged on a line at the same distance, with a central player with legs apart and two lateral players also with legs apart, who takes position on either side with foot in contact with the central player. The game consists of exchanging open hands blows while dodging or parrying the opponents. The central player, the protagonist of the game, turning now towards one player, now towards the other, will exchange with him large blows aimed at the face, which can be blocked or avoided. The constant presence of the third player behind will prevent the central player from avoiding blows by fleeing with his head and torso backwards, forcing him to face his opponent and so continuously building protective architectures in front of him. The name of the game may refer to the frequent use of the term far civetta in Italian, to mean the act of dodging a blow, especially by suddenly moving the head like the animal, the owl. On the other hand, we also find the terminology of toccare a civetta, to touch or tap at all, to the meaning of hitting, a terminology that could even arise from the game itself. In Treccani dictionary, it is mentioned the cry of the owl, cuckoo, as made by the central player to alternately call his teammates, or the lateral player waiting for the player in the center if the latter focused for too long on one of the two antagonists. The main characteristic of the Civettino seems to be that of the mandatory measure for practitioners, unlike free combat in which movement in space is a fundamental component. In Civettino game, the distance of the feet is fixed, given by the subject legs apart. In some representation, further limited by the overlap of the feet between the central subject and the lateral ones. This fixed distance concentrates all movements on the upper part, involving torso, head, and arms. The game, therefore, trains the ability to defend oneself from a blow, either with an active and propulsive defense of the arms or thanks to a rapid movement of the targeted area. It teaches the cautious attacks, and thanks to practice in 3, the sudden variation in the opponent, developing adaptation, improvisation, and situational reading. Particularly interesting from the point of view of understanding the game and its practice in ancient times was the lucky discovery of the presence of Civettino in an opera composed towards the middle of the 17th century, which give us dialogues and jokes that animate pictorial representations. This is the Il Paride by Giovanni Andrea Angelini Bontempi, performed for the first time in Dresden in 1662. In the third act, third scene, 3 auntie children dedicate themselves to the game of the Civettino in a clearing in the woods, interrupted at the end by the arrival of a bear that scares the 3 young people. The game is called Challenge by the 3, same terms used usually for the duel, and it's characterized by continuously negotiation, disputes on the position of the players if they are too far, or on the strength of the blows, or on the responsibility for the error, by warnings, by invitation to caution, by threats, jokes, and mottos. This scene can represent, although forced by the theatrical necessity, a good picture of the not very regulated nature of the game, and of its important component of challenge and playful activity, in which the part of sociality and verbal exchange is as important as the gestural one. Let's now see some variations and possible rules in the Civettino game. In numerous pictorial representations, the player in the center is shown with his hands palms together. This may suggest a starting position for the central player, which makes it more difficult to particularly block opponent's arms with his, or even preventing him from doing so, forcing him to limiting himself in dodging the attacks. In this way, connecting the etymology of suddenly moving the head to avoid a blow, of which we may have several examples in literature. On the other hand, the forced position can also serve to slow down the dynamics of the game, forcing a return to the position collected before each attack and each parry, in order to avoid an exchange of disorderly blows and educate concentration on a single and sudden gestures, much more similar to the precise and concentrated strike of a real battle. The lateral players, on the other hand, are practically always represented with one arm close to the face to protect, and the other one extended, with the center of gravity moved backwards to stay away from the central player as possible. However, the representation of the legs apart and the feet overlapping is not uniform, suggesting the spread of a variant with freer position of the player. In Nicoletto da Modena's print, the 3 participants of the game are not so linked, but the putto on the center seems also to be leaning against the 3 in the center, therefore still giving the idea of a fixed position, at least for the central player. In later representation, one of the most modern we have, we even find a 4th participant in the game, who lies on his back between the legs of the central player and holds one leg of each lateral player with his arms. Furthermore, this representation places the games in a scene with several characters, with a public present in a bucolic context of fun among a group of young people. In the most recent written description of the game, references is made to the objective of dropping or grabbing the hat of the player in the center, suggesting a less physical and dangerous version of the game. Considering the absence of the headdress in the players of the most archaic representations, we can hypothesize an evolution of the game which over time has lost a connotation of combat training. On the other hand, this did not make Civettino less demanding or completely deprived of the martial component, as we can see from the notes to Malmantile, where he speaks of beatings of the 2 lateral players to remove the headgear of the one in the center, and the big slaps of him to defend himself. A more refined version, such as the description of the Grande Dizionario della Lingua Italiana, Big Dictionary of Italian Language, allows us to imagine a modern version without any more strikes, but only with the grip of the cap. A transformation similar, we may say parallel, to the path of fencing, which from a necessary practice for the preparation of the warrior has progressively transformed into a sport game. The combat exercise with fixed measures that characterize the Civettino is part of an ancient and widespread tradition of which we find numerous forms and representations. We have already mentioned the possibility that during the battle and the combat with cold weapons, one could move from a wide measure to the so-called gioco stretto, the tight, narrow game, and then end up grappling with vast repertories of disarms, joint locks, and throwings. In these cases, the proximity and contacts with the opponent are controlled by at least one of the two opponents, and there remains the possibility of dissolving the measure to move apart, moving away from the other's body. However, numerous traditions have existed of binding one or both actors to a portion of space or to contact with the other's body, preventing free and independent management of the measures. Among the most archaic representations, thanks to Professor Ausilio Priuli, we find the rock carvings of Valle Camonica, which depict two boxers with 1 foot each in the square in the center, an example of ritualized fight within a narrow space. Another example of ancient origin is the tradition of the belt fight, in which the two contenders grab each other by the waist belt. We find references to it in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it is documented in a find dated to 26 centuries before Christ, a bronze statuette with two wrestlers who, accordingly to some interpretation, are also balancing a jar on their head. This tradition is widely spread among the peoples of Central Asia and appears in the traditions of the nomads in Mongolia. It is still practiced today, also with an international sport federation founded in 2005. In Europe, we can find interesting iconographies from the 13th century in which two wrestlers are always shown bare-chested. A possible trace of this tradition can be found in the aforementioned manuscript Postura, where among the teachings appears a starting position in which the two fighters start having both grabbed the opponent's body, evidence of a sedimentation of this practice. Subsequently forgotten or neglected, this custom reappeared in the second half of the 19th century, imported from Russia and widespread as Russian-Swiss wrestling, in which the two wrestlers wore a special sturdy belt with handles. A variant of the belt fight that appears in English iconography of the 14th century shows two opponents holding each other by a fabric lace or tissue around the neck. The same is also illustrated in a later manuscript of the German area. Inside European martial art treatises, we find the fight in the hall wrestling, practiced in the German area. This was a game training in which one of the two fighters suffered from the handicap of having to keep 1 foot fixed on the ground, while the other must stand on 1 foot. The fixed measure did not only characterize forms of an armed combat of a more or less playful nature, but also appears in the context of duel. The Nordic tradition of the holmgang was a ritual duel and involved fighting with swords and shields within a narrow space, delimited by a cloak or an animal skin fixed on the ground. The Icelandic saga of Cormac, before the 13th century, reports the rules of the holmgang. Sometimes in medieval times, we also find unusual duels in which the delimitation of mobility applies only to one of the two. These are the duels between man and woman, in which, in addition to the difference of weapons, the man is placed in a hole in the ground or in a barrel to prevent the movement of the legs in order to equalize the fight. In recent times, we find in the Italian popular tradition the duelli alla caprara, duels of the goat shepherds, violent clashes between opponents armed with knife and with their left arms tied each other, whose origins are traced back to the duels between shepherds from the region of Abruzzo, and then reported in the news among the most brutal customs, also widespread among the famous Roman bullies between the 19th and 20th century. A similar method of dueling with a knife and a tied arm or wrist was also widespread overseas in North America, with the so-called Helena duel, which owes its name to the Texan city of Helena. mentioned by the 1950 guide published by the Texas State Highway Commission. This type of clash has fascinating authors and artists, being reported in fictional works such as Leslie Scott's Western novel, or in the Far West film The Duel of 2016, and even appears in the choreography of the music video of the pop song. Outside of the regulated context that we have taken into consideration here, we cannot forget the heterogeneity and unpredictability of the war context. The engraving of Pollaiolo, Battle of 10 Naked Men, places two fighters grabbing the same chain right in the center. Putting aside the symbolic meaning and the artistic characterization of the composition, the scene represents elements of notable realism of gesture and weapon. In conclusion, different fields of knowledge become an opportunity for in-depth studies between apparently distant disciplinary sectors, with mutual benefit. Our understanding of the martial art is enriched by studies ranging from the metallographic analysis on original pieces, from archaeological studies on rock engravings, from studies of artistic and pictorial representation. The now developed sensitivity to the martial gesture and its dynamics is today an important interpretative support in such study contexts as art history, giving precious hints in the interpretation of martial sources. Thank you for your attention. I hope it was interesting for you, and in case you have any question or suggestion, please feel free to contact me.
Okay, let us thank Dr. Penso.